Okay, so an interesting story. First of all, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another Chris Chan quickie reading. And this one, we cover the delightfully morbid subject of death. Where, speaking of death, I should say that literally I spent the last 30 minutes that I dug out my 3-year-old Razer Siren head microphone, and I'm pretty sure the cable for that one is busted too, because it was working just fine when I had it here, and then just because I had the cable running underneath and just underneath underneath my table, just so I can hook it up, so it wouldn't be a hassle to like pull it back and forth, because it would like damage like the actual like the USB like stick of the cable. It just completely decided to die. The actual microphone I think was fine because it was glowing and everything like that. It's just it didn't work. And then my blue snowball mic, which you can probably see at the bottom here, decided it wanted to work again. So we're getting that out. And I'm not even bothering dragging like the arm out for this one. I'll just put it to the stick and just, well, we'll have it this way. So death and being brought back to life is something of a little bit of a theme going on tonight, ladies and gentlemen. But speaking of this, and to sort of like conclude the overall cycle regarding Chris's mental health, or his psychosis, as it were, we are going to be checking out Chris and the subject of death itself. So, first of all, and dying is not happening with me. I'm set to stay alive for thousands of years. Well, yeah, about that. Well, fortunately enough for Chris, by the time he does die, he won't be able to complain or say that he's going to live forever anyway after this, so, that's that. Now, some people have argued the case that literally Chris is just pulling our legs, to be honest, for years, but if he was, he wouldn't have done half the terrible things he's done ever since the internet first discovered him, and I think it's a little bit late to say that Chris is just playing a game, because he does legitimately believe in half the shite that comes out of his mouth. So let's go. Death is a concept that Chris has a notably hard time understanding and or coping with, be it the death of a human or an animal, or even an imaginary friend. While Chris certainly has the capacity to grieve and has undergone several periods of grieving in his life in response to deaths in his family, his other reactions towards death are considerably more perplexing. For example, there's been like many cases where Chris has viewed death as just something that's been designed to inconvenience him, and some things Chris has coped with so completely inconsistently that the only way to imagine that things are going on as normal is by resurrecting his own dog. His poor reactions to death most likely come from Chris's near inability to emphasize, a common symptom of autism, and childish thought patterns. Children often don't understand death, usually just thinking it's like sleeping forever, just leaving, or in Chris's mind, merged with their counterparts from C-197. Chris, being a child inside, some would argue outside, but no, that's not quite the case, can only resort to these clumsy analogies to understand death. So let's begin with, noticeably, family, various ancestors. Chris claimed that at Aunt Karina's funeral, his ancestors wished him a safe trip to Ohio to meet Julie. Yikes. Aunt Karina, 1934 to 2009. When Chris informed Julie that his Aunt Karina was dying, Julie insisted that Chris visit her in the hospital, which Chris had not considered doing. I have no idea why, you know what I mean? It's not like Chris was, at work that day. He asked Bob about visiting her, and she dissuaded him. He did get the chance to tell Karina that he loved her over the phone before she died. Karina's funeral happened to fall on Chris's birthday, which also happened to be Shrove Tuesday, also known as Fat Tuesday, or I've never heard it be called Fat Tuesday before, but Mardi Gras, absolutely. A Christian holiday that in some churches involves pancake dinners. Naturally, Chris has more concerned about missing out on the pancakes at his church at home than he was about the funeral of his own aunt. Yeah, well, that is absolutely true. Yeah, sadly enough. When the "I know I had to be sad because my dog died" excuse fails, Chris usually follows up with an offhand mention of his Aunt Karina. If that fails, the deaths of his many sweethearts tends to follow. Bob Chandler, his own dad. After a long battle with heart failure, Bob's life finally came to an end while he was hospitalized in Martha Jefferson Hospital's ICU. In an unreleased call with Jackie, Chris broke down sobbing over his father's death. The call, referred to by fans as the Black Tape, was sealed out of empathy for Chris. And yes, that's true. In fact, it's so sealed is that I don't even think it even exists anymore. I'm pretty sure it's destroyed because nobody has access to it, nor can anybody really find out where to get it. But it's probably best if it just literally disappeared forever. In an email, Chris told Jackie that my heavier cries from my father's passing is really hitting me bad, and lamented that in a previous dream, the Grim Reaper had promised that he would not claim Bob until 2015. Which, again, you have to admit is very strangely words for Chris, because would it not matter more in the eyes of Chris that if he knew that his father didn't have time left, then why did Chris not just think, spend more time with his own father? You know what? It's just, why is Chris so adamant that, death works like that? I don't get it. In a 31st of March 2012 Facebook message, Chris expressed a desire for Bob's ghost to haunt the dreams of anyone who doesn't like him, putting him on the exact same level as his dead dog. While this was an understandable reaction to discovering plans that trolls were going to dig her up, or discovering a webcomic that contained what he considered a mockery of her memory, his threat to send Bob's ghost after people was equal parts disrespectful and unreasonable, especially because of how reasonable and respectful the trolls actually were towards Bob Chandler. Oh, and by the way, this is the crematorium in which, the idea is that Barbara is meant to be buried alongside her husband, which is admittedly going to be a very awkward conversation by the time Bob does die. But yeah, again, you have to understand, again, 84 years old. I mean, that's not bad. That's not a, I mean, we know that Bob had a lot of issues towards the end, but he was quite good for in his life, I imagine. In a Facebook post from June of 2013, Chris laments that he had more freedom when his father was still alive. Once again, he literally decides the only thing to do is to make a mockery of Chris's memory, but of Bob's memory, because Chris never thought to actually take on any of the messages and just simply took his own father for granted. And goes on to complain about how he has to take out his time of his day to serve and protect his mother. Oh dear. Knowing Chris, this presumably means that he sat around in his room playing video games while his elderly father did most of the work around the house. In C-Log 0904-2017, Mr. C, Chris, while reading letters from his late father, displays emotion over him, tearing up at times. During the Idea Guy saga, and the rather disturbing events that took place with it, Joshua convinced Chris that Bob had reincarnated as a Sonichu with plaid-coloured fur in reference to his nickname, the Internet Lumberjack. Chris later retconned his design to a much simpler plain red design because plaid fur was, too much effort. In the eyes of Chris, at any rate. And turned up in the Quickville alongside Ted Bundy to defend the city. Using an autistic man-child's dead father to troll them is disgusting enough as it is, convincing them that said father is still alive in another dimension to help with their extortion efforts is on another level of fucked. And not to mention Chris literally had to somehow goad his mother into this for some reason. Here we go. Chris, to this day, still believes they're bullshit and will probably never accept that his father is gone forever. While in many cases, believing a loved one is in a better place after death is actually a very common and usually quite healthy way of coping with their passing, literally believing they are alive in your own fantasy dimension is extremely uncommon and extremely unhealthy, even by Chris's standards. Barbara Chandler, 1941 till whatever date. I really have none. Chris on whether he has plans in place for after Barbara passes away. I mean, we already kind of knew that, but thank you for confirming you have no clue, Chris, because, again, these are the sorts of things you have to be prepared for because, well, unfortunately, owing to events that have circulated, I don't really think Chris has that option either. It's sort of, yeah, he doesn't. Barbara is Chris's surviving parent, given that Chris is, as one of the incest fallout, legally prohibited from being anywhere near Bob. Chris is ultimately left with no coddling matriarchal to provide support for or keep him company. When she inevitably passes on, the fate of 14 Branch Lane Court will remain in question, and where everyone's favourite man-child will go from there remains a mystery, especially since it was revealed in a October 2013 Facebook post that Chris considers Barbara to be one of the few people who gives meaning and purpose to his life, or at least used to at any rate. However, in jail letters from summer of 2022, Chris began speaking negatively about Bob, insulting her and making rather disturbing claims about her, citation needed, in an effort to get his followers to help him buy her out of the house, which obviously failed. I'm surprised that sort of evidence was not turned over to the prison, and they should have, well, regional jail, I should say. Alongside Bob, who Chris entered a protracted period of grieving for after his passing, Barbara was one of the few people in Chris's life that he cared about enough to genuinely fear her passing, and Barbara used this to manipulate Chris into following orders on multiple occasions. One such instance of this was in 2011, prior to Bob's death, in which she threatened to commit the S-word as a last-stop resort to stop Chris from his poorly thought-out plan to attend MagFest in Maryland that year, by sleeping in his car as he did not have the money to afford a hotel room. A distraught Chris backpedaled, receiving only more guilt-tripping and down payment on some video game as a consolation prize. I think it was DC Universe Online was the game in question, but the fact that, well, Barbara, again, is not necessarily the greatest human being in the world either, and, well, would frequently use the notion that they were both elderly to, again, you could, I don't know. It's fucked up, and I just sort of wish I didn't have to have anything to do with it sometimes. Barbara used her health as a scare tactic for so long that it instilled paranoia into Chris. On one occasion, when Barbara failed to answer the phone when Chris called her while out, Chris panicked and called 911 for a welfare check. These fears, however, have recently turned into a twisted hope for Chris, complaining in a jail letter that despite guiding her soul into her Rose-Chew form/body, Bob's soulless husk still clings onto life inside the Sonichu temple. His sudden wishes for his mother to die could either be due to blaming her for his imprisonment, completely forgetting that it was Chris himself that gave out the information leading to his arrest, or that Chris prioritizes going back home over the life of his own mother. Both, I would say. You don't really need to say, it's pretty obvious, it's probably both. In November 2015, Chris released Family Needs to Appreciate Family, where he addressed Cole Smithy, David Allen Chandler, and Carol Suzanne Chandler to visit Bob before her time runs out. As time passed, and Bob's time inevitably did not run out, in November 2019, Chris posted a tweet where he copes with the mortality of his mother, imagining her becoming a part human, part Rose-Chew hybrid after death. In the same vein, he believed that Bob reincarnated into Robert Chew after death. Barbara was involved in a traffic collision on the 24th of November 2021. She suffered 2 broken ribs and a concussion, worsening her already declining health. A subsequent letter to Kenneth Engelhardt on the 11th of January 2022 claims that Bob fell lethargic, implying, but not confirmed, that she might be bedridden as of the car crash. Chris had then written in a 22 July 2022 letter where he comments on Bob appearing sickly and zombie-like, likely alluding to eventual death. Now, I should also point out that as of the recording of this video, the 9th of March 2024, there is no necessary or relevant information about the actual current state of Barbara and Weston Chandler's health. Also, I imagine this is something that they are going to do well enough to keep away from. And I don't really know exactly how trolls would be dedicated to finding this out. And I don't even think any of them even know where Barbara is currently located. Probably for the best, but there you are. Chris himself, 1982 to when? And believe me, in dreams and even in moments with my mind while awake, I have seen and felt that death light. Not only is it the most horrifying thing ever, but I am long not ready for it yet. So, kind of a bit like what he was mentioning about the Grim Reaper regarding his own dad, it doesn't exactly escape the notion in Chris's mind that death is something that's going to happen eventually. Because that's one thing is that depending on when this was said. In a conversation with the Wikipedia sysop, Chris once mentioned that he had been receiving recurring visions of himself walking into a bright light, which he one day hoped would be prevented from appearing by getting a sweetheart. After the surreal conclusion of the Love Quest in 2018, it is unknown if he still gets these visions. In a Facebook post on the 30th of October 2013, Chris stated that he had become so stressed out, specifically over the revelation that his high school gal pals did not actually like him much at all, that he had contemplated killing himself multiple times. According to Chris, the only reasons he didn't go through with it are painfully obvious. This just shows how much Chris's mentality is drained, and how badly he needs the professional help he so stubbornly refuses to get. Of course, this could well be Chris exaggerating and trying to gain pity as he has done in the past, which kind of makes it very, very hard to determine whether he was legitimately, in a very poor state, or whether or not this was just... This is the problem when Chris is, lies and lies and lies for many, many years, is because, how do you discern what's real and what isn't real with Chris, regarding how he really feels? And as his mother allegedly also has, or at least used to have, a habit of doing. In all seriousness, however, the S word is no laughing matter, and this should be looked at with caution. In a 2019 Discord chat between his fantasy enablers, Chris had claimed that he is set to live for thousands of years. Oh boy. In August of 2020, Chris, pretending that his body was possessed by Sonichu, uploaded a video will, apparently in case his body vanished from this dimension 1218. Cuckoo. Pets. Paddy-chan. Paddy was the Chandler's family's pet dog who died in June of 2006. Chris apparently drew a picture of a crying Sonichu face on the signature confirming the euthanasian process. As seen in the image used in this article, Paddy also appeared in the comic, immortalized as a furry character named Paddy-chan. This is particularly disturbing in the fact that Chris has apparently decided to deny his dog the afterlife that he presumably believes in favor of locking her in her own personal hell. To Chris, her death is the greatest tragedy of his life, which he often compares to the death of other people's family members and loved ones. Oh boy. Unsurprisingly, every single person he has said this to has become horribly offended. In Chris's plea to Clyde Cash, he equates Ryan Cash's death with Paddy's, and in the father call, he equates it to the death of Matthew Devoria's mother in the September 11 terrorist attacks. On the 1-year anniversary of her death, Chris even broke down in tears and had to be consoled by his mother. By comparison, the death of any sweetheart will result in a few days of mourning, at best. It should be noted, though, despite all of Chris's fondness for Paddy, her memory was still not safe from being defiled by trolls manipulating him. Because Chris thinks that that's more important sometimes than, again, putting your foot down over people over characters like Paddy or just completely innocent persons and animals in general. Nothing is safe from the wrath. Polo. Polo was a cat that was born sometime in 2003, and that was adopted by Chris in 2015, who had passed away in May 2018. On the 20th of May 2018, Chris posted an urgent tweet to Twitter stating Polo was having difficulty breathing and they needed money from eBay in order to take Polo to the vet. Following a wave of backlash due to how Chris was seemingly using Polo's sickly condition as a way to get sympathy for donations, Chris would delete this tweet. Despite his plea for donations, Chris announced on Twitter that Polo had passed away in the early hours of the 20th of May 2018. So, practically the same day, presumably due to the aforementioned breathing difficulties and or other natural causes. According to Chris, Polo was buried next to Paddy's resting place. Sorbet. Sorbet was a cat that Chris had adopted in 2016, who passed away in May 2018. In May 2017, Sorbet wandered out of the house and was hit by a car. Fortunately, Sorbet would survive the incident after Chris took him to the vet. However, in a video about the solar eclipse from August 2017, Sorbet was shown to seemingly have difficulties breathing. On the 17th of May 2018, Chris posted to Facebook in order to announce that Sorbet had gone missing after he was let outside. Chris would put posters with information relating to Sorbet on several telephone poles near the areas in hopes of finding him. A lot of people have surmounted the possibility that Sorbet just sort of wandered outside to die in peace. However, Sorbet would not return. In a text message from October 2018, Chris confirmed to a fan that Sorbet never came back and pronounced him dead. In order to cope with the loss of Sorbet, bear in mind this is two cats that were lost in the span of a week in the Chandler household, Chris claimed that Sorbet's soul had supposedly been reincarnated into Dimension C-197 as an anthropomorphic cat, and that he had since then been able to meet with him. Other cats. Multiple other now deceased cats that once resided within 14 Branch Lane Court, the most notable of them being Scamper, who had unfortunately passed away as a result of the house fire due to smoke inhalation, and Patches, a kitten that sadly passed away due to complications related to pneumonia only 1 week after Chris had adopted him. I mean, that entire story is completely fucked up anyway with what we know happened, and whether people, I'm gonna have like no choice but to talk about it one of these days, and I really don't want to. I'd much rather, and bear in mind there are other cats as well, like Kitty is like a really old cat that just sort of was just mentioned and then is gone. Lucy, however, to our knowledge, is presumably still alive. And the only other cat that we do know is Sylvia, who is presumably also still alive, but neither Lucy nor Clover or Sylvana are anywhere near Chris. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not entirely convinced that Chris just does not miss them either. Or maybe he just doesn't, to be honest. Maybe he just didn't really care for any of them. Then there's Snoopy. Snoopy was a dog who was adopted by Barbara alongside Clover in May 2012, who passed away in July 2021, just before Chris got arrested. Snoopy had apparently suffered a leg injury before he was adopted, causing him to have trouble walking for the remainder of his life. Following a long period of seemingly improper feeding habits, Snoopy died in his sleep during the early hours of the 14th of July 2021. After Snoopy's passing, Chris posted a eulogy dedicated to him on Twitter. In it, he explained that his neighbor and their daughter helped him bury Snoopy by a tree, making a stone mound around the burial to indicate where the body was. Chris was understandably distraught and saddened over the death of Snoopy. However, he still remained confident in his coping mechanism, the dimensional merge. On Twitter, Chris said that Snoopy was aware of the merge, which meant that him and Snoopy would reunite after the merge was complete. Chris would also bizarrely claim that he had seen an anthropomorphic version of Snoopy from another dimension during his burial, stating that he looked like a tall dog guy. You know, I will just say for the record right now, before we go any further, is that I've been to 2 funerals in my life, and they were both very somber and very profound occasions, definitely, ladies and gentlemen, because, well, I'm not really going to get into the details because they were family related, and when it comes to my family, they have absolutely nothing to do with any of this, so I'm keeping them deliberately out of this for that reason. But I don't really understand why Chris he had the need to mention things that nobody was buying or nobody was believing. I mean, listen, I think Chris is fully aware that Chris can't discern the difference between those who are just telling him the truth between those of the trolls anymore, because either Chris just doesn't care, possibly, or that, you know what, Chris has decided who he wants to believe and who he wants to listen to. So if you are somewhat offended by Chris saying things that are complete BS, and if you are aware of the context behind the way he raises and looks after his pets, as well as how he looks after those that not necessarily in his care, but the ones that he should care for, well, there's your answer. Imaginary friends. Chris is also concerned over the deaths of imaginary friends, aka thick beings of complete fantasy, and as Sonichu and his pals. Since Chris believes all cartoon characters exist in some universe, and he had created Sonichu's, he felt that he were to reboot the comics, that would mean that Sonichu's friends would all die, and that they would all reincarnate into their newer rebooted versions. Being his love and joy, the last thing on Chris's mind would be to kill his creations, but yet is perfectly fine with freezing them in time with his hiatus on the series. The Idea Guys allegedly extorted Chris out of thousands of dollars, telling him that they would destroy Quickville, which would lead to the deaths of Chris's imaginary friends. Chris paid up, even putting his own house at risk of foreclosure by skipping a mortgage payment to do so. Way to go, Chris. Ironically, even when Chris inevitably does pass on and go forth to meet Godbear, he will still be remembered, not only for his life and the many humorous misadventures in it, but for his comics. Thus it can be said Sonichu will never truly die. Simona Rosechew. During the Aspachew saga, a recurring theme was Evan's legal claims in regards to Simona Rosechew, as a derivative of his character Seamanchew. While early demands were for Chris to edit his old strips to remove Simona entirely from continuity, later Evan consented to letting Chris keep Simona's early appearances on the grounds that he kill her at a later date. Chris, not surprisingly, totally lost his shit, showing a much stronger emotional attachment to an empty, one-dimensional fictional character than he has managed for any living creature other than his dog. Finally, after being faced with the threat of legal action, Chris finally killed Simona in issue number 10. Although not before she laid an egg out of wedlock with her baby daddy Wild, though of course the act of laying an egg was never shown or even mentioned, which hatched into Sandy Rosechew. Simona's death apparently continued to hunt or haunt Chris long afterwards. This led to him reviving Simona in around May of 2014. More than 4 years after her untimely demise. It should be noted that, as revealed in the Alec Benson Leary phone calls, Chris considers cartoon characters to be real, living creatures that exist in some other world reminiscent of Toontown from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Simona's death was as real to him as that of any family members or sweethearts, perhaps even more so, because, well, who's going to say no to Chris with that level of logic? That's maybe the only thing Chris has going for him for the remainder of his life. Sad but true. Troll manipulations. A favourite tactic of trolls is to manipulate Chris into reacting to scenarios involving death, a concept in contrast to Chris's childish mentality, and thus guaranteeing he would either react in odd ways or in ways that could be used as ammunition against him for future trolling. The scenarios, though fictional, were presented to Chris under the pretense that they were true. While Chris genuinely went along with the claims that under pressure from troll manipulations, he did maintain some skepticism, such as when he expressed belief or disbelief to Casey months later on the Ryan Cash suicide scenario. The first death scenario trolls experimented with was in October 2008, was that of a fan whose father had passed away from alcoholism. When asking Chris for advice on coping, Chris briefly replied that the fan will recover from the father's accident and then advised the fan not to become an alcoholic. A few months later, another death scenario was invented by trolls involving the Ryan Cash character, designed to provoke Chris over his lack of work ethic on the Sonichu comics. The fabrication was that Ryan had been a Sonichu fan and committed the S-word when Chris stopped updating it. Trolls badgered Chris over multiple chats to keep acknowledging the death. Not satisfied with his brief replies on the death being sad, trolls then elevated matters by having the Clyde Cash character threaten Chris with revenge over the death of his brother. A frustrated Chris recorded a video in which he tried to reason with Clyde, and put his foot in his mouth by suggesting that if Clyde got a girlfriend, it would help him get over the death. Oh, and by the way, this is Chris's memorial to Ryan Cash in Sonichu issue 8. Also, I'd like to take this moment to remember Sonichu fan Mr. Ryan Cash, who committed the S-word when I impulsively said that I would stop the comic series in protest against the trolls on my ED page. Ryan, I'm sorry. Sad face. That's it. That's your helping. That's how Chris... Because, again, to Chris's knowledge, Ryan Cash was a real person. Sweethearts. Sometimes I remember her, but I have moved on. Chris on the late Panda Halo. Chris also carried out the death scenario fabrications using a few of their sweetheart characters. Chris had blunt responses to the supposed deaths and seemingly adjusted quickly when another sweetheart character professed to be in love with him. When Panda Halo's character arc ended, Chris believed that her silence meant she might have been a victim of the Australian Black Saturday bushfires, despite her location being hundreds of kilometers away. Shortly after her apparent death, the Julie sweetheart character was introduced to Chris. In a mumble chat, where trolls directed the conversation to Panda Halo's fate, Chris said, "It's okay though, at least I have a good woman who's willing to be at my side at this point." That did not take Chris very long to get over her now, did it? It's almost as though he didn't really have any feelings for her at all. You know what I mean? 9 months later, Sonichu issue 9 featured a special memorial to Panda Halo and a sequence in which she dies off-screen in a building fire after saving her Pokemon. Chloe Rosechew and Blaze Bob wrote Sonichu, so they wouldn't burn with her. Chris also dedicated all of Sonichu issue 10 to Panda Halo's memory. This would be almost touching if the alleged dedication didn't wholly consist of how awesome Chris was for using Panda Halo's artwork. Yeah. The Sarah May character claimed to attempt the S-word after Chris accidentally called her Julie multiple times in a call. After Chris attempted to talk her down, Sarah May went offline, still claiming she would kill herself. Julie, who was also in the chat, was playing along and did not react to Sarah's the S-word, attempting in any human-like fashion. Yet it did not occur to Chris that Julie's behavior was unnatural. Chris told Julie, "Well, at least I still have you. Okay, so, run along, Sarah." Chris then recorded quick shout-out to Sarah May, in which the only reason he offered her as to why she shouldn't commit the S-word was that he would be sad without her. What an absolute cunt. So, let's move on. When the Ivy character arc was forced to end due to Rocky Shoemaker's intervention, trolls came up with the scenario that she committed the S-word by hanging after being upset she couldn't be in contact with Chris. Chris uploaded Quick Boyfriend as a memorial, a poorly sung remake of Avril Lavigne's happy bouncy pop punk song, with lyrics changed to be much more about Chris would like women to date him. Chris included pictures of several past sweethearts in the video, making it less of a tribute to Ivy specifically, and more of a monument to Chris's failures. Ivy's demise was incorporated into Sonichu issue 9 in the form of a gruesome accidental death, which involved having gotten her neck broken with elevator wires after falling through the elevator floor. And this is Chris' advice to a fan. "Mary Jo is gone. I feel for you, but you should move on and try to find another woman who will treat you about as good, or possibly better than her. Suck it up and move on like a man would. I tell you as a man who had to do the same thing a few times in the past too. Which is possibly stands as one of the slightly more heinous, insensitive, and irreparable things that Chris has possibly ever said. But I can think of far worse things, and I'm going to do everything to not think about them right now, because I am not going to get upset over this. Well, one, because I know fine well that, again, this might not be a real person, but I know Chris is, you know. In a mailbag answer to the troll scenario of a fan grieving over the loss of his girlfriend, Chris clearly states he believes a death should be approached by a man, which includes finding another woman right away and a specific lack of grieving, and tells the traumatized fan that he should simply move on to a better woman since his girlfriend's death, not only being completely asinine, but also outlining he believes women to be replaceable and possibly interchangeable. You may remember actually a couple of videos ago I specifically stated that when Chris has such a poor attitude towards death, it also underlines that he has a poor attitude to other things as well. Like how I said, his attitude towards people with Asperger's is tantamount to also how badly his views towards autistic people are sort of one and the same, and well, there's your answer. Terrorism and assassination. Chris has a very juvenile understanding of how terrorism and its effects on the world. On the September 11 terrorist attacks, Chris wrote that it was the worst day in 2001, summarizing it as, an airplane was stolen and crashed in New York. 8 years later, trolls exploited Chris's childish mentality in order to manipulate him into making the Twin Falling Towers video, suggesting that he should mock Clyde Cash by saying he's as weak as the Twin Towers. And, by the way, I don't exactly know if that video, exists, but, well... Oh, wait, it does. Well, here it is.
Well, now, Mr. Clyde, your fame...
Hang on, wait a minute.
And...
1 second, I've got to, Dow... Okay, so where's the,
Just your fame and fortune shall fall just like these twins.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to do some work behind the scenes to make sure to get the audio not to just blast out of my speakers. So I'm sorry for this. So
Towers, they go crumbling down with an airplane. You are weak. I'm the strong one. You are going down, Mr. Clyde Cash.
Okay, so sorry I had to pause there for another moment, but now in case you're wondering at this point whether or not Chris for applying the sound effects of a plane was equally insensitive like this. If you thought that was equally insensitive, complete and utterly in bad taste, and was only really designed to hack someone off just because somebody gave Chris the slight impression that that was worth it, well, it isn't. And certainly wasn't. And something that Chris should have known fully better not to do just for his sake of, vengeance. Chris failed to discern that he was being set up producing a video in which he used Morse cursor to crash into a picture of the buildings while making explosion sound effects. And taunting Clyde after it backfired on him, Chris had to record an apology video for the 9/11 joke. Yes, so the story is that even Liquid Chris commented on the video. Chris received the most insubstantial backlash for this, and it resulted in this. Okay, so we don't really need to see that, but in case you're wondering whether or not it would have been better for Chris to actually show his face on camera while making the apology, and whether or not it would be better just to have cut the joke out entirely, it's entirely up to you. That's my personal gripe, but I don't think Chris could have done that, because, like I said, maybe he wasn't being true and honest. Maybe Liquid was the real Chris all along, since Chris would apologize for something. No, he wouldn't even stoop to that level. On the November 2015 Paris terrorist attacks, Chris expressed a modicum of grief in his own simple way, but equated the real-life atrocity which killed over 120 people with the actions of a cartoon villain, suggesting he still has a poor grasp of the difference between reality and fantasy. At some point in fall 2020, Chris tried asking No to kill someone. Wait, really? Why was Chris not arrested? Okay, so why was Chris not arrested then? But I don't know. We might have to cross that bridge when it comes to it. The S word. Taboo in Sonichu culture, the moment you threaten it, you're not considered a Sonichu. An idea guy posing as Chris L. Rosechew talking Chris out of contemplating the S word. Chris considered the S word in October 2013. After discovering the past events and friends were nothing more than trolls or arranged acquaintances. However, he ruled out the S word not only because of Bob and his pets, but also because of his belief at the time that the S word would leave him in limbo. In April 2018, during a chat with the Idea Guys in which they psychologically abused Chris, he commented that he would commit the S word. The Idea Guys then talked him out of considering it by drilling into his mind that the S word is taboo in Sonichu culture and that Chris could not be a Sonichu if he committed the S word. In June 2018, when talking about the infamous line "zapped to the extreme," Chris said he literally feels electricity in his body, that he states he isn't killing himself. In November 2020, Chris had a vision about the Chris Chan doppelgangers, which had been sprawled about by a spell Jacob Soklas had cast. In his vision, he believed that one such doppelganger to be working at Manchester High would die by either the S word or a heart attack, so that the doppelganger's power could be absorbed by the main Chris Chan for breaking the Iron Curtain. On the 19th of July 2021, Alan and his friend Bella joked to each other about there being a plan to get Chris to kill himself. In their chess club Discord server, Alan said, "I thought the plan was to get him to kill himself," to which Barbara responded, "Yeah, but by getting others to tease him, they're Jesus and they hate them and they are saying, oh no, those people are mean, and then he pays me." The chess club server was leaked in August, after which Alan claimed he and Bella had been making edgy jokes and that there was no plan to kill Chris, also pointing out a lack of proof the two had been serious. During the jail saga, rumours about Bella's comment were sent to Chris, who then falsely claimed in a jail letter in response to a fan's questions that he foreknew all about Bella and the setup and her want to tempt me into the S word. Chris repeated more misinformation in an October 2023 video in which he suggested that the incest call had been fabricated as a plot to get Chris to kill himself. Okay, that's like... okay. Dimension C-197s as Chris's version of heaven. During the Idea Guys saga, which affirmed Chris's dimensional beliefs, Chris began to think of alternative Dimension C-197 as heaven. He stated that he believes his deceased pets were reincarnated as characters and that his father is alive again. He also stated that Marvel writer Stan Lee's soul had merged with his C-197 counterpart. So sure was Chris in this that he even tried to console a woman whose father passed away. I'm not even going to read the rest of that. That's just like, fuck that. That goes way too far. And just for the amount of references this covers, well, that's just about that. I'm like, there's not even much point in wading through the rest of this absolute utter drivel, because it's depressing enough when you know fine well that this is just bullshit and that every single part of this is bullshit. Chris's attitude is bullshit. The comments he makes are bullshit. The way he treats people is bullshit. The way that he has so little actual, like, sympathy or, like, care for other people's well-being is bullshit. And I'm just kind of, like, a little bit, like, bored of Chris's bullshit, because it's when you go down these sorts of videos and when you go down this rabbit hole, you're only left thinking to yourself, really, this is like one of those occasions where the thought of like trying to feel bad for Chris kind of goes out the window because, well, why would you feel... Chris wouldn't... The only thing Chris wants to feel is good about himself, knowing that he's justified and everybody else is in the wrong. There's virtually not much else to it, and it's kind of depressing that when all is said and done, well, it was a fool to be sorry for Chris whatsoever. So there you are. The real death... This is the life and death in Quickville, so... There you are. I'd rather move somewhere where... Like, fear and loathing in Quickville, we should call it. And I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. What an absolute nightmare this was.